Good afternoon. My name is Tara McBride. I'm an attorney. I practice in the areas of employment and civil rights law. I came to this stage by a little bit different path than most of the women here today. You see, I wasn't always Tara. I was born Todd. I'm transgender. What does that mean? What does it mean to be transgender? Well, to understand transgender, you have to understand the difference between two different concepts. One is physical gender. Everybody pretty much gets physical gender. It's pretty straightforward. What plumbing do you have? Everybody gets that. The second part, though, is gender identity, and that's a little more tricky because for the most part, the population in general, gender identity and physical gender are congruent, so there's never a need to really differentiate between the two. But gender identity is what's between your ears. It's an innate sense of self. It's an innate sense of being man or woman. I always tell the gentlemen in the audience, if you were in an auto accident on the way home and lost your genitals, you wouldn't wake up the next morning in the hospital room and go, I'm a girl now. You just wouldn't. And just because a woman goes through a complete hysterectomy or a double mastectomy makes her no less a woman than she was before those procedures, does it? I've always known that I should have been a girl. From a very young age, I knew. But I grew up with a dad who was a Marine. And I was the eldest of two children and the only son of a Marine. So I grew up hearing things like, toughen up, be a man, don't cry. I knew I couldn't say anything about what was going on between my ears. And so I hid, like most of us do, we hide. But all the time that you're hiding, you're living a lie. You're living a life of lies. You're not being true to who you really are. And so there's a lot of negative emotions associated with that. There's a lot of fear and anxiety that somebody will find out what's going on between your ears. There's a lot of isolation and depression because you can't talk to anybody about it. There's a little bit of guilt and shame associated with, why do I feel like this? Am I the only one? And there's always, always, always this self-loathing because you're living this lie. You can't be true to who you really are. All those negative emotions sort of roll up on themselves, and as you grow older and your life starts to hem you in, it's not a really good combination. Among the general population, the attempted suicide rate is 1.6%. Among the transgender community, it's 41%. 41% decide that it's just an easier option to end themselves than to deal with the fact that they're transgender. That's how scary this is. And I've had a lot of accomplishments in my life, but this is by far the scariest and the most difficult thing that I've ever had to deal with. It's scary being transgender. Every year, transgender women are murdered just for being themselves. In fact, in Ohio last year, there were 3 transgender women murdered and a 4th nearly murdered as she was beaten to within an inch of her life, simply because they're transgender. It's scary. It's a scary, scary proposition. And nobody who's transgender, who goes through the transition process of simply trying to align the outside with what's always been between their ears, nobody who's gone through that transition has done so without loss. Who would do this voluntarily? Who would risk losing everything they've ever worked for? Who would risk every relationship they ever have had, whether it's family or friends or coworkers? Who would risk all of this, what, just to wear a dress? Put on some makeup? Who would risk this? Who would risk spending an entire rest of their life being mocked and ridiculed and harassed and assaulted, maybe killed? Who would risk all that, what, just to put on some makeup or wear a dress? Nobody chooses to be transgender. This is something that chooses you. And then you spend a lifetime trying to deal with it as best you can. And for 41% of the transgender community, it's just a better option to end yourself. This is extremely difficult and extremely scary. But I always have been, and I always will be a woman. So what I ask you today is that you examine your own attitudes towards transgender women, that you maybe start to think of us more as just people dealing with a very difficult thing. And we're no different than anybody else in this room. We're just simply trying to scratch out a little corner of happiness for our lives. We're just trying to be true to ourselves. I ask you to re-examine your attitudes towards transgender women. I ask you to be an ally of the transgender community. There's so much that needs to be done to bring that 41% down, to make this less scary than it really is. I don't want anybody who goes through this to have to feel like ending their life is just a better option. Thank you.